The screen is black. A single whisper cuts through the silence. A daughter raised to be a wife, not by accident but by design. Now imagine you stumble across court records sealed for more than 2 centuries, documents so disturbing that 3 judges who first read them refused to proceed, claiming they could not bear the weight of what was inside. These records tell of a family in Virginia's tobacco country, 1784, seemingly pious, a family everyone admired. But inside their estate walls, they were crafting something so grotesque, so deliberate, it shattered the very idea of innocence. The man at the center, Jonathan Caldwell, a towering aristocrat, calculating, cold, obsessed with legacy. He believed that land and bloodline were sacred treasures that could not be divided. He believed the family name was more important than human life, more important than God himself. And so, when fate or perhaps something darker delivered into his hands a fragile orphaned girl named Elizabeth, he saw not a child in need of protection, but an instrument, a vessel. The resemblance was uncanny. Elizabeth looked almost identical to his late wife Catherine, who had died in childbirth. To the world, Jonathan presented himself as her benefactor, her savior, the noble man who would raise her as his daughter. But in the shadows of Millhaven Estate, he was setting the stage for a transformation no child could survive intact. We would mold her with education, refinement, and dependence. He would shape her identity until she no longer belonged to herself, because to Jonathan, Elizabeth was never truly his daughter. She was his chosen bride, preordained by the twisted logic of power and preservation. The neighbors never suspected. The church never intervened. The law looked the other way. Yet deep within hidden files discovered decades later, the truth sat waiting, proof of forged documents, whispered oaths, a young woman's life engineered to serve one man's obsession. Now 2 centuries later, you are hearing it. Knowledge that was meant to be buried, knowledge that demands something of you. Because once you see what happened inside Millhaven's walls, you'll begin to see how power always works, how institutions bend, how families conceal, how society itself conspires to keep its darkest truths hidden in plain sight. This is not just history, this is a mirror. When the Higgins family was first reported missing in 1965, the official story was that they had simply left town. No forced entry, no blood, no signs of a struggle, just an empty house, meals left unfinished on the table, clothes still hanging in the wardrobe, the father's tools still in the shed. To the police, it was inconvenient, but not alarming. Families leave, people run away. But the neighbors whispered something different. They claimed they saw light in the Higgins home, on nights when no one was supposed to be there. I heard the sound of children crying, muffled by walls. And only once someone swore they saw a figure standing in the upstairs window after the family was already gone. But here's the part that should make your blood run cold. In the weeks before the disappearance, multiple people in the village said the Higginses were not themselves. They were quieter, more withdrawn, speaking in half sentences, as if someone or something was listening. Their youngest daughter was heard muttering strange phrases under her breath, words that no one could identify, like a language that shouldn't exist. Some said she was repeating what her father whispered to her. Others claimed she was speaking to something unseen. The police brushed these accounts aside, calling them gossip. But the reality is darker. The Higgins case shows a pattern that history does not want you to recognize. Entire families vanishing without trace, leaving behind homes that feel like shrines to unfinished lives. If you look deeper, if you start pulling at the threads, you begin to see the machinery of silence. The Higgins family didn't just disappear, they were erased. Their files buried, their names excluded from local records, their property quietly absorbed by the government months later. And the more you examine the case, the more it feels less like a disappearance and more like a removal. Why would an ordinary family in 1960s England be targeted for such an operation? What did they know? Or worse, what did they witness? The Higgins home was not an ordinary English dwelling of the mid-1960s. It sat on a lonely street at The edge of town, away from the rows of worker cottages and the more fashionable new builds of the suburbs. It was a stone house, older than the factories that had swallowed up the countryside, with walls that seemed to hold memories longer than most families dared to stay. Locals said the house had a pulse. Strange thing to say about a building, but they meant it. Windows rattled when there was no wind. Lights flickered even when the power companies swore the lines were stable. And if you stood outside its gates at night, you would swear you heard movement inside, even when the whole family was said to be away. The Higgins family had moved in, just 5 years earlier, but whispers already clung to them like smoke. Neighbors noticed odd schedules, doors opening and closing at hours when no lamps were lit. Shadows seen on the second floor long after the children were put to bed. Postman spoke of voices whispering near the stairwell when the door swung open, though no one else was visible. And then there was the basement. It had been sealed before the Higginses arrived, padlocked, as if to keep something in rather than out. But at some point, Mr. Higgins removed the lock. And after that, the sounds began. At first, small things. Soft tapping like knuckles on wood, dragging sound across the stone floor. Then, louder footsteps pacing directly under the sitting room. When no one was down there, Mrs. Higgins confided to a neighbor that she sometimes heard her children speaking to someone at night. But when she opened the door, they were always alone. That neighbor, who later swore she would never set foot near the house again, recalled the look on Mrs. Higgins's face, pale, hollow-eyed, as though she already knew the house was feeding on her family. In England, in 1965, such things were rarely discussed openly. The age of superstition was supposed to be long gone, yet the Higginses' home became an unspoken subject in town, a place of murmured warnings. Nobody wanted to deliver packages. Their tradesmen refused to work inside. And slowly, as if guided by some unseen hand, the Higgins family withdrew from the outside world. The house had taken hold. And once it took hold, it never let go. At first glance, the Whitmore household appeared ordinary, even enviable. Neighbors spoke of their grand dinners, or hymns sung in harmony on Sunday evenings, and the sight of all four wives working the land together. But beneath this carefully arranged performance, shadows were gathering. The first cracks appeared. In whispered account, strange lights seen at night within the house, long after candles should have burned out. Some claimed they saw Mr. Whitmore walking the halls alone, lips moving as if in conversation, though no one else was present. His wives, too, began to show troubling signs. Each grew pale, withdrawn, and increasingly detached from the community. When spoken to, their eyes seemed distant, almost rehearsed, as if someone else's thoughts had been carefully placed into their mouths. But what chilled the townsfolk most were the children. Born from 4 different women, they should have carried distinct personalities. And yet neighbors swore that every child spoke in the same strange cadence, repeated the same odd phrases, and stared with an intensity that left grown men unsettled. It was as if individuality had been stripped away, replaced by something uniform, mechanical, and alien. Behind closed doors, there were other reports, far darker. Visitors noted the locked cellar door that no one was ever permitted to enter. They claimed that when the wind blew just right, low murmurs like chanting could be heard rising from beneath the house. At night, the Whitmore farm stood unnaturally silent, as if the very birds avoided its airspace. Still, no one dared confront Mr. Whitmore. His influence was growing, his wealth expanding, and his grip on the community tightening. The church leaders seemed strangely complicit, brushing aside concerns with hollow reassurances. And so, the questions piled up, unanswered. What was happening inside the Whitmore home? Why did his wives seem like reflections of each other, drained of their former selves? Why, above all, did the children behave as if controlled by a single hidden hand? It was no longer just a family matter. It was becoming a mystery that threatened the entire territory. By the late summer of 1865, the Higgins disappearance had become a national whisper. Newspapers carried the story with lurid headlines: "The Vanished Family of Lincolnshire." Yet behind the sensational reporting, a quieter, more unsettling drama unfolded because those who dared to investigate the Higgins case did not emerge unchanged. Inspector Arthur Mallory, the first to arrive at the Higgins property, gave an account so disturbing that it was deliberately omitted from the official police report. In his private diary, which was only uncovered decades later, he described the farmhouse as if it were still occupied by unseen tenants. He wrote of warm teacups sitting half full, chairs pulled slightly away from the table as though the family had just risen, and a peculiar scratching sound that persisted inside the walls even though no vermin could be found. Mallory confessed that he left the property with the strange conviction that someone or something was following him home. Within 3 months, he resigned from his post, citing nervous exhaustion. But Mallory was not the only one broken by the house. A second officer, Sergeant Crowley, vanished while performing a follow-up investigation. He was last seen walking into the Higgins cellar with a lantern. When colleagues returned minutes later, the lantern still burned on the dirt floor, but Crowley himself was gone. No trace of him was ever recovered. Officials quietly attributed his disappearance to desertion, but locals whispered that he had been taken by the same force that claimed the Higgins family. This pattern repeated itself across every stage of the investigation. Crucial records. Witnesses recanted their statements or disappeared altogether. The files that survived were locked in restricted police archives, with one chilling note scrawled across the cover page: "Do not pursue. Nothing here but madness." Even the parish priest, Father Whitcomb, who was called in to bless the home, abandoned his vocation shortly afterward. He gave a single, cryptic sermon before leaving his post forever. The House of Higgins is not a house of man, but of something older, something that has always been waiting. Here lies the most disturbing fact of all: those who sought the truth about the Higgins family either went mad, disappeared, or actively tried to erase the case from memory. The question that lingers is simple but devastating: what did they see inside that house that was so unbearable it destroyed their will to speak? What happened inside the Higgins home on the night of their disappearance remains one of the most unsettling puzzles in modern folklore. Neighbors spoke of a sudden silence and eerie stillness that spread across the street like a disease. No dog barked, no carriage passed. Even the clocks, they claimed, seemed to tick slower. And by morning, the Higgins family had vanished without a trace. Authorities who entered the home found the supper table set with plates of food that had gone untouched. A lamp still burned in the parlor, though its oil was nearly gone. Upstairs, the children's beds were neatly made, as if no one had ever slept in them. But the strangest detail was this: in the master bedroom, on the dresser, someone had scrawled a single word into the dust. Remember? Some called it a warning, others a taunt. Investigators tried to scrub it from the record, dismissing it as a hoax, claiming it was the work of local pranksters. But the handwriting did not match anyone in the neighborhood. And according to one constable's notes, the word appeared to be written in something other than dust, something thicker, something that dried dark. The newspapers, hungry for circulation, painted the Higgins family as victims of supernatural forces. Spiritualists flocked to the small English town, performing seances and claiming to channel voices of the missing. Each gave conflicting accounts. Some said the family had been taken by beings not of this earth. Others whispered that the Higginses had been sacrificed in an ancient rite. But behind the sensational headlines, a darker suspicion brewed. What if the Higgins family had not been taken against their will at all? What if they had left willingly, abandoning everything in pursuit of something greater or more terrifying? And here's where the story twists into dangerous territory. Records suggest the Higginses were not ordinary at all. Mr. Higgins, it turns out, had written several private letters that were confiscated and sealed away, never meant for public eyes. Whispers among archivists claim those letters describe a Kalenja voice only he could hear, summoning him and his family to a place where men are not meant to walk. That line was enough to terrify even hardened investigators. What kind of force could lure an entire family into vanishing? What kind of voice could command absolute obedience? The more one studies the Higgins case, the more it becomes clear. This was not an accident. Not a crime of passion, not even a kidnapping. It was something orchestrated, something rehearsed. As if the Higgins family knew this day was coming and prepared for it. But here's where the story turns from disturbing to catastrophic. Because the mystery of this case wasn't just about who disappeared, it was about who controlled the silence that followed. When the neighbors began to demand answers, when whispers of foul play grew too loud to ignore, a curious pattern emerged. Authorities who should have investigated instead buried the trail. Records were filed incorrectly. Testimonies were omitted. Even the church, which had once stood as the moral backbone of the town, suddenly declared the matter unfit for discussion. Why? Why would an entire community, not just the guilty act, as though the truth itself were poison? What we see here is not a simple disappearance. It is the machinery of psychological control at work. People are told subtly, consistently that some knowledge is too dangerous to touch. They begin to police themselves. They censor their own questions. They smother their own suspicions. This was not just about the Higgins family anymore. It was about reinforcing the idea that ordinary people had no right to the deeper truth. And isn't that the exact tactic used by institutions throughout history? Keep the masses entertained, distracted, or afraid, while the real decisions are made behind closed doors. In the case of the Higgins family, the disappearance became less important than the silence that followed it. That silence was engineered, and it reveals something chilling. The family's story was not an accident. It was useful to someone. Who benefits when the truth is hidden? Who gains when people stop asking questions? The disappearance of the Higgins family, and investigated, unspoken, unresolved, served as a lesson to the entire town. There are places you are not allowed to look. There are truths you are forbidden to touch. Once you accept that boundary, you've already surrendered. By the winter of 1868, something horrifying had happened in that Kansas town. The official journals of the county courthouse, usually meticulous in their records, contained a peculiar gap. Weeks of entries were simply missing, torn from the book, as if someone had tried to erase a piece of history itself. Oh, but who would dare destroy government records? And for what reason? When whispers emerged that those pages contained details of the four brothers, speculation ignited like dry timber. Some said the boys had been taken away by doctors from St. Louis, men of science eager to probe the mystery. Others insisted the church had intervened, fearing that the brothers were a blasphemy, curse, a reminder that man could be molded in ways that contradicted Scripture. And yet the most disturbing rumor of all came from a night guard who swore. He saw horse-drawn carriages rolling into town under the veil of midnight, escorted by armed men who bore no local insignia. When the sun rose the next morning, the brothers were gone. No one signed their departure. No doctor filed a report. No priest blessed them. They had been erased, like the torn pages. And yet what the town discovered weeks later was worse than silence. A farmer swore he found strange pits dug in the frozen earth at the edge of his field. Pits shaped too neatly, too deliberate, as if made to contain something. He covered them back up in fear, refusing to tell the authorities. Claimed they saw men in dark coats, setting fires in the forest, their faces hidden, their movements practiced, ritualistic. It was as though the entire community had been placed under a Spalleech family, silently agreeing not to ask too many questions, not to look too closely, because deep down, they knew that whatever had been done to the brothers, whatever forces had orchestrated their disappearance, was far greater and darker than anything they could comprehend. In this silence, power had spoken. The missing records, the empty houses, the rumors of pits and fire, they were not accidents. They were a declaration. Some truths will never be allowed to surface. By now, the whispers had grown into accusations, but not against the true culprits. Convenient scapegoats were chosen. Poor family, a drifter, a nameless servant who was said to have gone mad. The institutions, the courts, the churches, Very authorities sworn to protect the people redirected suspicion with the precision of a stage magician. They didn't solve mysteries, they buried them. And they knew that the masses, eager for a simple answer, would accept any story fed to them as long as it promised closure. But the true horror lay in what was left unsaid. Behind closed doors, the whispers weren't about demons or curses, but about inheritance, property, and bloodlines that had to remain pure. The silence wasn't protecting the frightened, it was protecting the powerful. Every missing name, every falsified record, every closed investigation of a careful strategy. You see, the system has always had one goal, not truth, not justice, but preservation of itself. The people at the top cannot allow cracks in the facade, because once the illusion breaks, the entire structure collapses. And so, the Higgins case, like so many before it, was not investigated, it was erased. Newspapers suddenly shifted their tone, reducing what was once called the most baffling disappearance in modern England to a mere family tragedy. Witnesses changed their stories, officials contradicted themselves in the same breath, and the deeper you look, the more you realize it wasn't incompetence, it was orchestration.
Ow.
Because the real truth would have shaken the foundations of power. If the Higgins family was silenced, it wasn't because they were weak, but because they knew something they weren't supposed to know. And history has shown us again and again that families who stumble upon forbidden knowledge don't just disappear, they are erased. So the question becomes, what was it that they discovered? What secret was so dangerous that an entire system had to conspire to bury it? The Higgins case ends not with resolution, but with an open wound. No bodies were ever found. No suspects were ever charged. No explanation, scientific, spiritual, or governmental, has ever satisfied the gnawing hunger for answers. And so the story is passed down like a cursed inheritance, whispered in pubs, buried in half-burned police files, locked in vaults of families too frightened to speak. But silence itself is the loudest testimony. When records vanish, when witnesses retract, when institutions deliberately erase the trail, what does that tell you? It tells you that someone or something fears the truth more than the public fears the mystery. The Higgins disappearance is not just about one family, it's about control. About how quickly lives can be erased, how easily the narrative can be rewritten, and how powerless the common man becomes when hidden forces decide what is official history. Perhaps the Higgins family stumbled upon something forbidden. Perhaps they were recruited, silenced, or sacrificed for purposes we dare not imagine. Or perhaps their very existence threatened a system that thrives on conformity and obedience. Whatever the cause, the outcome was the same. A family of 5 wiped clean from the earth, leaving only shadows. And here's the most disturbing part. The Higgins are not alone. Across history, families vanish, records are altered, towns are silenced. Each case dismissed as coincidence, each file buried under the weight of time. Yet the pattern remains. Like a code, like a warning. So ask yourself, when? The next disappearance happens, when another story is smothered before it begins, will you dismiss it? Or will you recognize the shape of the darkness behind it? The Higgins family is gone, but the system that erased them still stands. Watching, waiting, controlling. And if you listen closely late at night, when the streets are quiet, you may hear what the authorities never wanted you to hear, the echo of a family calling out from the void, reminding you that truth once buried does not rest, it waits for you.